Good evening, everyone. Welcome to a online Inform seminar. I'm Suzanne Newcomb, the current Honorary Director of Inform and Lecturer in Religious Studies at the Open University. And today I'm very pleased to be exploring transformations of paganism, identity and practice, looking at some of the ways that contemporary paganism has changed over the last 20 or 30 or 40 years, depending on the timescale our speakers would like to look at. As many of you in the audience are very well aware, Inform's an independent educational charity which provides information about minority religions and sects, which is as accurate, up-to-date, and evidence-based as possible. We exist to prevent harm based on misinformation about minority religions and sects by bringing insights and methods of academic research into the public domain. We were founded in 1988 by Professor Eileen Barker at the London School of Economics with direct support from the UK Home Office. And we moved to the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at King's College London in 2018, where we're now based. So please feel free to email inform@kcl.ac.uk after the seminar if you have any thoughts about the seminar, questions, feedback, ideas about what to do better next time, and or future seminar topics. We'd love to hear from you, get your ideas and questions. So the format of the seminar is based on the approach pioneered by Eileen Barker, the founder, which is to bring people from a variety of personal and professional experiences who have a shared interest in a theme that is of relevance to new and minority religions, and to get them in the same room talking to each other. And also to get academics talking in dialogue with the people they study and the people their research affects. This seminar is a bit unusual in that most of our speakers bridge the kind of practitioner-scholar divide in some way, but they're very well placed to reflect on the changes and transformations of paganism. So I'm very excited to hear what they have to say. So quick housekeeping things. We will be recording the speaker view of this session and we'll make it available on YouTube afterwards. We will continue to record while we take questions from the audience at the end. To ask a question, please either type in the chat box with your question or use your hands up function, and then we can turn the microphone on or ask you to speak your question. And we'll try to fit in as many people as possible. If you want to ask a question anonymously, send a direct message to me on the Zoom. So you pull down the arrow and you send it to Suzanne Newcomb, and I can ask it on your behalf. So all the speakers are going to have 10 minutes. This is to keep it quick and interesting and facilitate dialogue at the end. I'm going to try to keep any interruptions for people who are going over time to a minimum, but I'll try to not be too abrupt about that, but it's kind of hard on Zoom, so please don't take offense. I can't like casually pass a note. And so our first speaker is going to be Professor Michael Strymska, who we're very pleased to have joining us tonight. He's a professor of global studies at the State University of New York, and he's done quite a lot of work in Scandinavia and has a wealth of reflections to offer us tonight on the subject of depersonalizing paganism. So over to you.
Great. First of all, I want to thank Inform and the seminar organizers for inviting me here today to share my thoughts on a topic of great concern to me. Let me begin with some general considerations and also with the shared screen. You all see that?
Yes, great.
Okay, very good. Modern paganism, and let me jump to the next screen actually. Modern paganism, like most religions, serves to provide its participants with a sense of connection to something beyond themselves and a community based on this connection. This something, in the case of paganism, is differently conceived in different types of paganism, but typically involves some or all of the following elements: the natural world, supernatural divinity, and I apologize for the street noise. That's the supernatural divinity expressing itself in the form of a cement truck, I think. Ancestors and the dead, ethnic or racial identity, and a historical narrative encompassing both the repression and the revival of the given pagan religious tradition. I've come to see the value of all these elements in different contexts, but I've also, with a special regard to Norse paganism, come to see the ethnic or racial identity dimension as the most problematic, as the ethnic identity dimension can all too easily be turned into a spiritual support system for white supremacy. The most clear-cut solution might seem to be to completely abandon all reference to ethnic, national, or racial identity, but this is neither feasible nor desirable. As many pagans base their religion on ethnic traditions and ethnic identity, which only become problematic when interpreted in a racist manner. I wish to advocate not for totally rejecting the ethnic dimension, but counterbalancing it by investing more energy into the other elements I spoke of above in order to move away from racialized identity constructions and move toward a more inclusive and transcendent spirituality. I think of this as de-personalizing paganism insofar as it involves shifting the focus of paganism away from personal and tribal identity construction toward a more transcendent vision of larger spiritual realities. Perhaps I would have done better to call this transcendental paganism, but I did not want to face lawsuits from the heirs of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the founder of TM. The nature dimension is not so hard to imagine in a depersonalized way. Nature has no race or ethnicity. Particular natural manifestations may exist in particular locations, but reverence for a sacred tree or river in one location need not render a person blind or hostile to the sacredness of other trees and rivers in other places. This does, however, require taking a certain hermeneutical step. The natural things we love and find sacred must be understood not as discrete, isolated objects that some particular group or ethnicity or race or nation can claim to exclusively possess, but as reflective of universal natural processes and powers that we are honoring in a particular place or instance. Depersonalizing pagan divinity is more controversial. I'm sure many pagans would insist that the personalities and human-like attributes of their gods and goddesses are extremely important and meaningful, and that any diminishing of this aspect would rob paganism of much of its richness. I advocate for a two-tiered notion of deity, similar to what is sometimes applied in Hinduism. On one level, the gods and goddesses have their existence as individual beings with mythological life stories who we can worship as personal entities. On a higher level, there is an overarching divinity that all the individual gods and goddesses derive from and participate in. In the language of the Hindu Upanishads, the gods are many, but the gods are also one. This could be labeled as pantheism or panentheism. This perspective could be extremely useful for combating racism and paganism. Thinking in terms of a higher level of divinity that embraces all individual deities from different traditions implies that people of different ethnic, racial, or national backgrounds are also spiritually related through their devotion to gods grounded in a shared, transcendent reality. This insistence on ultimate commonality between pagan traditions cuts the ground out from racialized group identities, and this would obviously be more to the liking of some pagans than others. The next element that I mentioned at the outset, the relationship to ancestors and the dead, might seem to be entirely incompatible with the program that I am proposing, but I believe this is not necessarily so. To again borrow from Hinduism, there is the ancient Vedic idea that the familial dead should be honored and remembered up to the third generation, and after that, understood as unnamed generic ancestors without any individual identity. They are no longer anyone's mother or father, granddad or grandmom, but simply the dead writ large. If our modern paganism adopted a similar attitude, then we could come to divide our dead into two groups. The familial dead, comprised of relatives who we can actually remember with some specificity, and a group of more distant dead who lose individuality and become part of a higher spiritual reality. Depersonalized in this way, the ancestors can no longer serve as rallying points for racialized group identity, but only as aspects of a higher spiritual reality transcending race, tribe, and nation. I believe that the ethnic dimension of paganism can also be reinterpreted so as to maintain its positive elements and minimize its negative potential. The argument would be that while a particular form of paganism may have originated in the traditions of a particular place and people, it was never fully distinct or separate from other traditions to begin with, and that in our time, it can be expanded to incorporate people and traditions from other places. Where there is an accepted original starting point for a given tradition, a homeland, so to speak, pagans with past ancestral or other links to this homeland could celebrate this sense of connection, while others could pay tribute to the homeland as a point of reference, while understanding themselves as part of the story of the continuing evolution of their chosen form of paganism. The historical narrative of paganism could likewise be enlarged to include a more universal story of peoples, cultures, and religions worldwide that have been repressed but have survived and are now reviving. Less concerned with one's personal group, more attention to the larger world. This would break down racialized identity by pagans making common cause with others outside the typically Eurocentric map of paganism. I would furthermore suggest that pagan devotion to the sacredness of nature provides an obvious bridge to indigenous peoples and others around the world, including environmentally minded Christians, Jews, and Muslims. All of what I'm proposing today may strike some pagans as ridiculous, as overly intellectual, idealistic, politically correct, or impractical, but I believe there's no way around the discussion I am advancing. In my 2005 book on modern paganism, I described the ethnic and universal forms of paganism as two opposing poles. In subsequent years, I've become increasingly concerned that the ethnic orientation may involve a limited, blinkered perspective that may fail in the most basic function of religion or spirituality, to connect us to something beyond ourselves, something higher, deeper, greater. If the only purpose of ethnic paganism is to glorify ethnic identity, it is like a camera that is only able to take blood and soil selfies, with no larger view of the world of which our ethnic traditions are only one small part. Ethnic traditions and identities can be beautiful and inspiring things, but they have to be understood within a larger spiritual context, a context that is indeed universal and not just a crude expression of tribal narcissism. And I'll end there. Thank you for your attention.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your impeccably timed presentation and interesting suggestions. Our next speaker is Dr. Suzanne Owen. She is a reader at Leeds Trinity University, and she is going to be speaking on Druidry, which she's been studying for a very long time now. And her title is Druidry an Indigenous Religion? Thank you.
Yes. Hello. Yes, thank you to Inform for inviting me. And so I'll just launch right into this because of shortness of time. So I have been researching Druidry more or less since while I was doing my PhD. My PhD was on First Nations in Newfoundland and also on the sharing of ceremonies across North America. But I was already attending Druid groups in Scotland when I was doing my PhD. And then after finishing it, this became my kind of next interest. Right, so while there are international criteria for recognition of an Indigenous people as first come, non-dominant, and so on, there are no official criteria for recognition as an Indigenous religion. And over time, I began to kind of separate these because observing First Nations and observing Druids, I noticed that they were kind of engaging with rediscovering their traditions or just, in the way they're relating to land and nature in similar ways. But one group is indigenous people and one group is not. The Druids are not. So many indigenous people, of course, also do not practice, I guess, indigenous religion, which they usually refer to as traditional spirituality. Among the group that I was mainly researching, the Mi'kmaq in Newfoundland, largely identify as Catholic, at least on the census, though many of them do participate in traditional spirituality in any case. Druids rarely, if ever, identify themselves as indigenous people. And if they do, at least on the forums, they're often pushed down and told off for doing so. So it is policed within Druidry, and I'm sure they do exist, and they probably have gone underground a little bit, at least from public Druid forums. Now, indigenous religion itself has been defined by indigenous scholars, religious studies scholars. James Cox, my own PhD supervisor, emphasized that indigenous religions are community religions of oral societies. And our own Graham Harvey here, one of the definitions is that he put forward as belonging to a place. And Druidry, I would say, does not strictly fit the former, that they are community religions of oral societies, but more so the latter. And that is where I've focused my research on Druidry as indigenous religion. It began with reading Vine Deloria Jr. For my PhD and his book, God is Red. And I was surprised to see him mention the Druids. He said that each land projects a particular religious spirit, that in fact, Druidry is once again arising in these parts, and that this may indicate that these are Druid lands. And he also says that it doesn't matter whether the present practitioners are precisely following the ancient religious practices, which is very true of contemporary Druidry, and that this is less important than the fact that the religion has contemporary followers who are attempting to make the proper connections with what has gone before. And that is where I started to think that, okay, so the Native Americans are proposing that this was against appropriation of a Native American spirituality and to encourage those who are of non-Native background to seek their own traditionals, their own sort of indigenous traditions in Europe instead. So it comes out of that context. And Druids themselves, particularly in Britain, I wouldn't say this is globally true. After reading Larissa White's recent publication on world Druidry based on her global survey, it does seem that those, particularly within the British Isles and Ireland, inclusive, and perhaps parts of Europe as well, they do consciously sort of articulate Druidry as an indigenous religion, such as Arthur Pendragon, the Druid campaigner. He said that we are looking at the indigenous religion of these isles is not a new religion, but one of the oldest. And you can see this on various self-descriptions of Druids by some of the organizations that we have in the UK, such as the Druid Network, a registered charity, which was founded by Emma Restelor. And in their description, in their constitution, they highlight that Druidry was the native spiritual tradition of the peoples. And then towards the end, that is acknowledged to be of an older indigenous of ever-evolving religious tradition sourced from these islands. So there is this conscious notion of Druidry as being indigenous to these islands. And Restelor, again, with Philip Shallcrass in the Druid Directory book, they also said that Druidry originated in what we now call the British Isles. And this view is derived from a comment by Julius Caesar in his Gallic Wars, that he referred to Druids and saying that it is thought that the system of training was invented in Britain and taken over from there to Gaul, and that those in Gaul in the present time, if they were diligent students, would then travel back to Britain to study Druidry. And I've seen Druids cite this passage in particular to back this claim. And I also did a short questionnaire with Druids myself many years ago. And mainly, I started off with the Irish College of Druids, which are based in Northern Ireland. And then I did similar sort of questions with white Druids on the Isle of Wight and Druid Network. And the indigeneity discourses emerged in answers to the questions I set about how they came to Druidry and what they thought was distinctive about Druidry compared to other pagan traditions. And some of the answers also indicated this idea of Druidry as indigenous. So in Druidry, we can still find elements of the ancient spiritual knowledge of our ancestors. It is the indigenous spirituality of the land, a reimagining of native spiritual tradition. And it's of these isles. And Druidry is to England, maybe Britain, what when I look at indigenous peoples of the world. So making that comparison there. And this identification is sometimes a political choice. And some are concerned about the reburial of ancient human remains and access and management of ancient sites such as Stonehenge. And they will invoke indigenous rhetoric. And they are often inspired by other indigenous people around the world. Well, not other, I should say that they are not indigenous, the Druids are not indigenous, but they are inspired by indigenous people around the world. And the Druids position themselves as speaking for the ancestors. However, for many Druids, I feel it's more that the concept of indigenous resonates as it emphasizes a connection to the land. Now, when I've presented this kind of topic at different conferences, including Native American and Indigenous Religious Traditions Conference and American Academy of Religion and the Native Traditions group, I've heard a couple of comments to say that, well, despite the historical claims that, you know, the Druids were colonized by the Romans and the Normans and so forth, that they would not be considered a colonized people. Present-day Druids are not colonized peoples. And that this claim to indigeneity may be diminishing the suffering and harm done to indigenous people. And I think that is something that ought to be taken on board. And many Druids do, and they do refer to this when they are reflecting over avoidance of cultural appropriation. And the other criticism is that Druidry is not strictly a kinship or community-based religious tradition, if you want to define indigenous religion that way. It may be argued that it is a common feature of indigenous religions around the globe, but you do not find it necessarily in pagan communities. And this might be debated by some pagans, where kinship and community is loosely defined, and also what is meant by kinship, and is it a development of animism? Again, referring to Larissa White's recent study on world Druidry, 64% of Druids identify as animist. And so there's obviously an effort towards building this kind of kinship outlook. But I think for many indigenous people, it is meant through their social group in terms of their human relations, as well as those who are non-human. Also, is it the earliest religion of Britain? It is often presented as such, you know, that this was around during the time of the Romans, but it's debatable that contemporary Druidry in Britain is a continuation, and many, at least in Britain, would reject the idea that it is a continuation of Iron Age religious, if we want to use that term anachronistically, tradition. However, if it originates from the land, does it matter when, you know, when it started? You know, does indigenous religion have to start in the long distance path, in, you know, before anything else? Can it not originate from, you know, tomorrow? You know, can a new indigenous religion appear? So these are some of the considerations to have when considering a pagan group as an indigenous religion. And so I end with proposing what I would define as an indigenous religion as opposed to indigenous person. And this derives from Brian Deloria Jr.'s writings about making proper connections with what has gone before. And so I propose that an indigenous religion is a religion that relates to the land and the people, including other than human persons, and that which has gone before. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Interesting themes of definitions and what it means to be pagan and indigenous, which I'm sure will come up as we go through the rest of the speakers this evening. Our next speaker is Dr. Rune Rasmussen, who is a historian of religion and now an independent scholar. And tonight he's going to talk about unvikinging the past. Gosh, that's a bit hard to say. Unvikinging the past. Thanks.
Great. Thanks. Is my sound all right? Cool.
Yeah, great.
Right. People all over the world are crazy about Vikings. My ancestors, I'm Danish, so I'm supposed to think of myself in the image of these Iron Age coast pirates that historically existed in a rather short window around a millennia ago. Now, the Viking, as we know it, was invented in the 19th century with the explicitly stated purpose of producing nationalist self-image. And I think that this project has contributed to implementing what Graham Harvey calls the modern separatist agenda, that partly unsuccessful attempt to deanimate matter and disembody minds. Because it is about an interior essence rather than, for instance, a kinship relation to other in the land, a relation that reaches out of yourself. So my working thesis is that these national essences have some sort of link to that part of modernization that has to do with rejecting animist knowledge. And that's what I'm basically interested in, the study of rejected Euro-traditional animist knowledge. And one very important part of the rejection processes is this encasing animism in this distant past, where it becomes very much a bygone for once, and it also becomes part of this sort of noble savage imagery, this essentialism, which is continuously being renewed. Here is imagery from the TV series Vikings. Apparently, reinventing Vikings as essential whiteness is a rather sexy thing. You know, it seems you need underwear models to do it. But this fetishizing actually develops while intangible and tangible animist heritage is continuously under attack, in fact. And there are many examples of this. The landscape around the village where I grew up, perhaps 30 burial mounds. Nej, Putte, du skal ikke komme herind nu. Nej, Putte, du skal ikke komme herind nu. Jeg sidder lige midt i noget. Sorry about that. My little girl just came. Yeah. The landscape around the village where I grew up, perhaps 30 Bronze Age burial mounds had been plowed down. There are 2 left, probably 4 Bronze Age burial mounds just in the fields of my father's farm in the last perhaps 100 years have been destroyed. Ancient hubs of transforming land connectedness, sacred sites that are perhaps 3,000 or 4,000 years old. And I think there's some sort of positive relation to that enclosing of animist culture in this distant past, where it comes to serve as an imagery to produce this interiorized nationalist essence, rather than doing what animism is supposed to do, which is creating reciprocal, transformative, respectful relating between humans and the land we inhabit. Scandinavian animism is deemed in and illustriously nationalist if and only if it is a Viking, and it's deemed out if it is not Viking, a process that I've called Viking washing, rejecting traditional knowledge from our self-image because it isn't Vikings. Just one example of this traditional knowledge that has been sort of flushed out of cultural memory for not being sufficiently Viking is the runic calendar, a beautiful reckoning system where time is animated as a transforming meanings really that spring from the cycles of the sun and the moon, but it didn't originate in the Viking Age. Note how we would intuitively think that runes have to probably be something that's super Viking, but there were runes for close to 2 millennia in different parts of Northern Europe, and the Viking Age is 300 years. So the Viking concept seems to be simultaneously over-owning this piece of North European culture while motivating its rejection for not being Viking enough. And boy, I haven't even started talking here about the role of racisms and ultranationalisms and all that stuff, and how that is enforcing marginalization and rejection of Euro-traditional culture. Right. Now, my perspective on North European traditional knowledge means that I'm sort of trying to counter this trend. For instance, I've been looking at national symbols of my country for that rejected animist knowledge that has been pushed away in the emergence or in the construction of such symbols. There are other models for self-image and social coherence that is sort of in the history of those symbols. For instance, totemism, which is a very clear example of an animist form of culture is connectedness with specific others in the land. The Little Mermaid, for instance, the root of this symbol is tales of totemic marriage between humans and perhaps a seal or a sea spirit, and this goes all the way back to heathen mythology. Medieval ballads recount how the human breaking this marriage results in collapse and madness in human communities. This figure is then taken in by national romanticism as a personification of the state, Denmark, and with Hans Christian Andersen's tale, the broken relation is being naturalized. The human deserts the mermaid, and she now rests in a kind of cosmic tristesse about the modernist non-relation, which Andersen narrates as the natural and right state of affairs. She's decidedly not supposed to be in relation with humanity, and that's sort of the core of his story. And with this rejection, we have reached the contemporary modern national symbol, which encapsulates our seclusion from the land, this broken bond of love, but also, in fact, the longing of the land to become subjective through relating with us, right? And this is an important symbol, and I've basically been repeating and expanding on what I've said here now and talking about it. But in my view, that's not enough talking about it, because I believe that it is sort of implied in animists' new animist thinking that animist knowledge is realized in actual engagement. And therefore, my idea of unvikinging the past cannot stay with these reflections or perhaps insights. So at some point I decided to try to have a go at the national flag here in Denmark. According to myth, this crusader flag was given as a blessing from God to the army of the Danish King Valdemar the Conqueror, who were busy massacring some pagan Estonians about 800 years ago. But the thing is that Valdemar's father, Valdemar the Great, he also had a decisive battle. And in that battle, the sign of victory that came down from the sky was not a flag, but like in the former pre-Christian age, it was the ancient trickster, shaman, ancestor of his kinship group, ravens. And this is an extremely important kinship relation in Northern Europe, particularly in southern Scandinavia, and I think in England. Ravens have been steeply demonized through history. In Denmark, they were named the apostle of Satan. This being became no longer this totemic kinship and shamanic subjectivity iconized in the human-faced, entangled in the raven, but it became this evil, cursed being. So I did some research on this. I did some research on the North European raven totemism, and I presented it in different ways. But what I also tried to do was to bring this into practice, this insight in the rejected animism behind this symbolic development, which is why I introduced the contemporary raven flag, which is here being used by an Extinction Rebellion activist in front of the Parliament building. This was not conceived as a national Danish thing, but more as a kind of a general symbol of connectedness the trickster voice of our age that symbolizes recovering this kind of totemic kinship between humanity and others in the land. Right. So particularly this symbol here is interesting in this respect, because when we talk about unvikinging the past, because the raven flag or the raven banner is in its original historic context, in fact, a rather very Viking thing, but using it like this tries to take it out of this seclusion in the distant past, out of also associations with war and conquest and whatever, and dialogues with actual meanings in the North European raven symbolism that makes it into a contemporary relevant symbol for people today. And that seems to be somehow working. People are, in fact, in some level, sort of catching on to this idea after I introduced it. So yeah, this is an example of how I'm trying to deal with the problematic thing of the past. But it also implies another question that I don't have an answer to yet. And that is this whole Viking thing, is it only actually this problematic kind of seclusive rejection function that serves to basically dispel or disenchant almost, or is there also more positive motivational imagery that leads people or can lead people towards recovering the kinds of animist kinship that I'm sort of aiming at? And yeah, that was just a little opening question to sort of perhaps modify my other point. That's what I had to say. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rune. That was fascinating. And it leads very nicely to our next two speakers who are sharing the platform together. Dr. Melissa Harrington, who's press officer for the Pagan Federation and a trustee of the Pagan Federation International, and her daughter, Lucia Harrington, who's a student at Glasgow University and outreach link for Extinction Rebellion in Glasgow. And together they're going to explore transformations and identities and ideologies in Wicca, from witch cult to saving the world.
Well, thank you. Can you hear me, Collie? Hello? Thank you very much for having me and for the amazing work that you do. Given the shortness of time, I'm going to dive straight into share screen and rattle through my talk. So I hope we can everybody see that?
Yeah, it's great.
Okie dokie. So here we go. Wicca as a new religious movement can be dated from the mid-20th century, when Gerald Gardner claimed he had been initiated into the last surviving remnant of a secret pre-Christian pagan priesthood persecuted in the 17th century witch hunts. He was supported by Professor Margaret Murray, a former Egyptologist who was the president of the Folklore Society and thought that documents from the witch trials provided evidence of this ancient faith. Scholarly research at the millennium indicated that Wicca had more likely grown out of the 19th century romantic pagan revivalism and perennial esoteric traditions of the occult milieu, which exists as a constant creative countercultural force that works in a dynamic duality with mainstream Western culture. The dynamic interchange of culture, scholarship, and practice has exerted a constant pressure on the self-identity of Wiccans, with Ronald Hutton's Triumph of the Moon fueling a change of self-perception from being inheritors of the ancient wisdom of the witch cult to being practitioners of a modern pagan tradition that fulfills contemporary spiritual needs. This new knowledge was absorbed with a certain amount of cognitive struggle. Going from this to this. As it was a watershed identity shift from an emotionally satisfying founding identity of historically validated veracity, spiritual superiority, and righteous victimhood to a reappraisal as practitioners of one of many new religious movements. The Wiccan identity of Braze, wise, secret rebel evolved in the fertile ground of late 19th century Romanticism and the occult revival and the pre-hippie alternative communities in which Gardner and many other influencers such as Dion Fortune moved. Thus, Wicca can be seen as an opposition to mainstream culture and Christianity. I found in my PhD that most participants were nominal Protestants who had left Christianity prior to finding Wicca, but they were not drawn by overt rebellion or a call to the dark side. Rather, they were drawn to positive aspects of a spirituality that fitted their psyches: personal Gnostic spirituality, an overarching magical framework, a responsible attitude to nature, egalitarianism, feminism, and the autonomous practice all played a part. But the strongest factor for all respondents was the call of the goddess, the divine feminine, who had been written out of Western religion for millennia. Wiccan practice may be viewed as radically countercultural, but to practitioners is quite cosy and takes place in small groups in suburban homes. Wiccans may be a long way from the level of fear that was palpable in the late 1980s, when, due to the satanic abuse scandal, Wiccan parents rightly thought they might lose their families to social services, but wariness remains. Thus, the most important contemporary transformation has been increased recognition as a valid religious path and more robust societal mechanism to counter discrimination while practicing the largest other religion in Britain in the 2011 census. Though sadly, this is still some way to go, according to the recent survey of discrimination by the Scottish Pagan Federation. Wiccan identities are not normally developed in relation to local ancestors, although Wicca was once synonymous with nature religion and spirits of place are honoured. However, lineage is a huge issue, as it is the indicator of denomination, praxis and community. The advice given years ago was to attend pub moots, 20 years ago, was to attend pub moots and read books for a year and a day in order to choose wisely. This still applies today, but the mass of often erroneous information available on the internet is confusing, and organisations such as the Pagan Federation, 50 this year, still provide volunteers and safe spaces for seekers to make sense of it all. However, due to this confusion and growing up with the internet, some Gen Z witches say they prefer the internet and meet like-minded people online with no locality other than cyberspace, but a global community. During the COVID-19 pandemic, many older witches began to experiment with internet rituals, and this experimentation is ongoing. It enables community and has been a vital part of the social mechanism of Wicca during these hard times. Many Wiccans are engaged in community work within the pagan organisations and in political movements of their choice. But currently in British paganism, there doesn't appear to be much public pagan political movements. However, the political influence is perhaps inherent in that countercultural dynamic flow. We can look back at the 1980s Greenham Common, the eco-paganism, the New Age travellers who blocked roads, dug burrows, lived up trees in protest, and see where the spirituality has inspired and sustained environmental activism, and where ritual is being incorporated consciously into public invisible theatre to raise awareness. Wicca continues to evolve. Campaigning at COP26 in Glasgow may seem a long way from joking about your American witch mum on TikTok, but these are both aspects of the Wicca of Gen Z. 21st century Wicca is diverse. On one end of the scale, initiated Wicca remains a closed secret society, while at the other, spells sell and girls giggle on public video. But one thing is guaranteed: where there is rebellion, there are witches, for the witch is the ultimate rebel, as is her goddess soul. And where there is a counterculture, there will be chance. As proposed by Eric Tiriakian in the 1960s, occultism seems to be visibly arise at times of societal change, bubbling up from our collective cauldron of creativity, and where people can draw on that reassuringly perennial occult teachings and seek out those hidden maps of human consciousness and the tools they offer, as society itself redefines its identity and we all try to find our place within it. Thank you. And now I think we have Lucia.
Hey, hello. I'm going to go straight into my screen share, just for a moment. Okay, thank you. I'll just start now. So Magic and Rebellion, how Wicca shaped me into the environmental activist I am today. So just to give you an introduction, I am the outreach link for Extinction Rebellion Glasgow, but I also was raised by Wiccan, my mum and dad, Rufus and Melissa Harrington. And today I'll be talking about how growing up in a Wiccan household shaped me into the person I am today, and my passion for environmentalism, how this related to my involvement within Extinction Rebellion, and how I've noticed that green movements and paganism share some similar roots, and how this leads to similarities and parallels between the cultures within these two groups, and also how my identity as a pagan has led to my sustained participation within environmental action. So despite the fact that my parents were, Wicca has been an important part to my parents' lives, I wasn't raised as a Wiccan. This was to avoid indoctrination, but it was also in reaction to the satanic abuse scandal my mum previously mentioned in her presentation, and also to make it easier for my brother and I to integrate within a tight-knit, predominantly Christian semi-rural community. However, they didn't hide Wicca from us either. Parts of it were hidden, the parts that are meant to be hidden for non-initiates. But when we were old enough that my mother's fear of us being taken away was less of a threat, my mum and dad would talk more about Wicca, and also we'd always attend like pagan festivals and hand fastings of family friends. However, we weren't your typical family either. I think there were many examples of me in my childhood where the way my parents raised me, their pagan beliefs definitely filtered in to their parenting. One example of this would be when we would go and walk as a family. We didn't just walk through nature. My mum made the point of taking the time to be present with nature, and that connection to nature has very much stayed with me into adulthood, and I think is the reason why I was attracted to environmentalism. So to the left here, I have a quote from Ned Flanders in The Simpsons saying, "Oh no, her Buddhism has led directly to witchcraft," where in my experience, it was actually the other way around. So am I a witch today? And what does it mean to be a witch in the 21st century? Today, I would actually describe myself as a practitioner of socially engaged Buddhism, but with pagan roots. I do not feel like I can call myself a Wiccan because I'm not initiated into any Wiccan groups. Not that you necessarily need to be, but that's just my way of feeling. But I feel that again, these kind of lessons my parents brought me up with, and this consciousness within connection to nature, the symbiotic relationship with it and other people, actually made it easy for me to understand the Buddhist concept of interdependence, which then enlightened me to the Buddhist path, which I have continued to follow. So in my life, I use the main principles of Buddhist ethics, and such as the Eightfold Path to guide my life, but I also take part in pagan festivals. I use the Wheel of the Year, and take part in divination such as tarot, even though that's not necessarily pagan. That is associated with what might in contemporary like witch culture, like associated with witchcraft. I also think that paganism and engaged Buddhism are compatible with each other. I do think that the Heart and Lotus Sutra are compatible with the Wiccan mood. But how did this lead to my interest in activism? So when I found out about the climate crisis, it wasn't just something that like, oh no, nature's under threat, that's a shame, this is just another political issue. It actually felt like a threat to myself and everything that I loved, because again, that connection with nature runs so deep. And I felt a responsibility to protect it. But also because when I was first moved to Glasgow, when I moved away from my family home, I felt lonely and I was looking for other people to identify with. And when I stumbled across an Extinction Rebellion meeting by accident, I noticed that these rebels, they didn't see that nature was just something that surrounded them. They saw that it was something a part of them, and they saw that, and that informed the way they lived. And that is just something I related to so much and wanted to be a part of. I felt at home straight away with the Extinction Rebellion, and I noticed connections between my pagan upbringing and certain things within environmental movements. What I think this comes down to is that green movements and paganism have a similar shared root of nature-based practice. And I think the way it manifests in the most clear way would be how in Extinction Rebellion, in the wellness side of our organisation, we have this thing called regenerative culture. And regenerative culture is actually developed from indigenous cultures such as First Nations people. And it's the idea that our actions are our summer period, and after that we go into our autumn period of reflection, followed by our hibernation winter period of rest. So then we're ready for spring again to prepare for another action. Again, this is very similar to the pagan wheel of the year, and again, it is that idea of us living as natural beings in nature. Our bodies follow this kind of cycle. And again, I felt at home with this. Also, there are some ritual and ceremonial aspects to activism and organisation. And by that, I don't mean that Extinction Rebellion activists are taking part in rituals. That's not what I mean at all. But meetings will open with our intentions and holding space for each other, and will end again with holding space to each other again. It's very circular. We also have forms of theatre within activism that actually mimic like symbology of nature spirits. You can see on the left here, we have the red rebels that represent that, and our connection to nature. The blood that we connect, like, makes us human, makes us connected to nature. It is sorry, I've lost my chain of thought. Despite that, and what's interesting is that when we do these kind of performances, we also find ourselves criticised by some of the same criticisms pagans experience. So we see that we're called hippies, tree huggers, but also even othered and seen as dangerous individuals when we're dressed like that. There was one article associating these Extinction Rebellion activists with like Satanists, saying that we were doing satanic rituals on the beach. We weren't. We were just doing a performance on the beach during G7 at Cornwall. But we're still seeing it that way because they're pushing nature. They're demonizing nature-based religions. Nature-based movements, which I found quite interesting. Also, there's another thing, that there are many Extinction Rebellion pagan and pagan Extinction Rebellion groups. The Extinction Rebellion is no way religious, but many religious people within Extinction Rebellion form their own affinity groups. So we have Christian rebels, we have Buddhist rebels, we have pagan rebels, and what they do is they come together and they work together to do environmentalism in line with their religious beliefs. And I genuinely think that Extinction Rebellion has made me a better Buddhist pagan. I live more in tune with nature, my body, when it comes to my working life. I'm politically involved with creating the life that I want. One that is in line with my religious belief, one that's nature-led, one that is full of compassion. And I'm no longer anxious about speaking openly about paganism as I was a child, being fearing of being taken away. I actually feel comforted by the fact I'm surrounded by people who understand this nature-led living and understand paganism, and actually think that it's kind of a cool thing to be involved with. Another thing is, like, I've been involved in Extinction Rebellion for a while now, and when I first joined, I didn't really know as much about politics and privilege as I do now, and I question a lot, like, why is it that I put so much time into Extinction Rebellion and not other movements? And sometimes I criticize myself. I think that maybe that's a result of my class privilege, of my white privilege, that environmentalism is like the idea of the climate crisis is the only perceived struggle I will face as a white middle class woman. And whereas other people might be fighting for, you know, basic rights that they are not afforded to them. But then when I think deeper about it, I realize that I actually am involved in lots of different works and anti-racist work, but the reason why I put a lot of effort into Extinction Rebellion is because I found home there in the community, that made me feel at home because of the pagan upbringing I had, that connection to that nature and community. Like in Buddhism, we have the word Sangha, where we go to our community for refuge. And in Wicca, you have your coven where you go for spiritual guidance and to find that sense of community. And for me, as a modern pagan Buddhist, I actually find that Extinction Rebellion is my Sangha and my community that I find home with both politically and spiritually. And it is my political family and a true form of modern comradeship. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Lucia. That was fascinating to see the new transformations and places you're finding your identity. So our next speaker is Ross Downing, Dr. Ross Downing, who's going to speak to us tonight on Tropic Thunder, the paganism in Germanic paganism in a new global context. But he has a wealth of information about paganism and heathenism throughout the European context. So look forward to hearing you speak, Ross.
Thank you. I don't know about a wealth, but we'll see. Let's see if we can get the screen share going. Right, can everybody see that?
Yeah, it's great.
Lovely. Yeah, so this is basically going to be a condensed version of work in progress field study work that I'm engaged in, based on many years of contact with heathens, and heathen will be the preferred nomenclature. It's basically Germanic neo-pagans. Asatru is also another one that is commonly used, but I'll think heathens is easiest. So I'm looking at personal stories rather than quantitative studies, and I'm really interested in to see how the new data sets that haven't really been represented in academia so far are allowing us to see how the story of heathenry is the narrative is changing, and I think someone needs to look at it. So if no one else does, I will. And here we have a Tunisian informant talking basically about how his relationship with Thor has changed his experience of nature in Tunisia. This looks overfacing, but I'm gonna zip through it because I think a lot of you will be familiar with the history of neo-paganism in general. But this is how basically going to break this down, orientation, and then actual data itself. So far, again, recapping probably something that you already know, Germanic neo-paganism is perhaps the new religious movement that is most closely tied with the ethnic question. To put that in historical context, it really has its roots in national romanticism in Europe, and the ideas of, for instance, Vikings, or what a typical Dane is, or what a typical Briton is, or Welshman, Druids, all these kinds of things belong in the 18th century, 19th century mindset. A lot of these languages and archaeological artifacts were coming to light, being, old languages being translated into modern English or modern Danish, things like that. Obviously, the Second World War was a big turning point. Just around that time, we had some people that were very, starting to become very, what's the word? They didn't care how they were seen, basically. They had the freedom to not only to be anti-Semitic in the case of Alex Rudd Mills in Australia, but they had the social freedom to say that I am not a Christian, and they could write books and get somewhere with that. The other turning point obviously was the 70s, new religious movements. I think the main three organizations that still exist today were all founded in 1972. Obviously the internet changed everything for the better, of course. And I think we could probably say that the majority of heathenry, as it is internationally, is quite, the mainstream seems to be anti-folkish. Folkish being basically an extension of the German language and racial nationalist movement in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and extended into the national romanticism of Scandinavian countries and England. Three figures who were pivotal for what we now call heathenry. They're kind of almost caricatures of the different types of heathen that still exist, I guess. You have the right wing, you have the eccentric, and then you have, you know, the idyll of a guy living in a log cabin, the hipster perhaps. Scholars of heathenry specifically have seen that there is a consistent issue with ethnicity, and I don't think there's any more to be said about that. I'm not going to spend too much going into that, but if you want more info about that, I can certainly give you quite a lot. We don't know how many heathens there are in the world. It's probably impossible. It's just like saying how many Wiccans are there. One of the best indications that we have is on Iceland, population of 300,000 people. The indications are that there are probably twice as many men as women in Iceland, at least. And I think this is generally a fair indication of what's going on, but we don't know. We just don't have the statistics. One interesting thing I think you can see here is certainly before the internet and what's happened in the last 10 years or so is there's been a population explosion, specifically in heathenry, but you could possibly argue that this is the case for lots of contemporary pagan movements. What is heathenry? Depending on the study itself, they will perhaps highlight different areas of interest. So, for instance, Matthias Gardel, in his book Gods of the Blood, he was very much focused on racism in heathenry, or the overlap there. And he was quite keen to underline that heathenry was not just about race. They had all kinds of people in there. So that was his narrative in that book. Graham Harvey has written in an anthology trying to summarize at the time in 97 the access to sources that he had, saying quite fairly that there is more of a representation of men and the right wing, but this narrative is changing. Obviously, it has changed since 97, and it's certainly changed since 2003. Frederick Gregorius was talking about how Swedes themselves felt that the heathen religion was somehow organic, it was somehow part of Swedish culture. Now, that I think actually applies not just to Swedish heathens, but to heathens all over the world, really, certainly in kind of Euro-descendant Anglo countries like Australia and America. Where I digress from, or depart from previous research, is the data that I'm getting is showing that there are heathens in whose narrative is completely different. There's a surprisingly large number of very active agents who are female, identify as female. And obviously the racial ethnic ancestry is almost impossible in a lot of these countries. So it's not even in the context anymore. And I find that really exciting. So yeah, it's an extension of globalization and mediatization, basically. So it's happened in the conversion stories that I'm hearing have happened in the last 10 years or so, which doesn't mean that they're all young people. One of the things that I was expecting to find was that they would be aware of the racial argument, and Okay, let's not get too ahead of ourselves here. But there are similarities between heathens in the countries that I'm going to outline, and there are obviously big differences between heathens in, say, in Scandinavia, or where research has been done before, like in North America. To give two personal excerpts from personal stories, conversion stories, I don't feel I've ever entertained the question as a faith problem. I don't feel like I chose to believe in the first place, more like it chose me. I mean, this is a classic conversion type story, I think. And even though Eileen lives in South America, when we have, say, a midsummer solstice, she's having a midwinter solstice. I thought that was interesting. You know, how do you relate to that? Wasn't an issue for her. A lot of conversion stories are also about a personal relationship with a deity, and how that person, how that deity has directly influenced their personal life, say getting a job, losing a loved one, that kind of thing. One of the images seems to have disappeared there. You'll see the black boxes. I was trying to hide the person's identity. Just as a kind of case in point there, there's a Japanese female in her early 20s. She has visited Norway. Her relationship with heathenry is very much intertwined with heavy metal. She feels extremely isolated in Japan because there are no other heathens, and just generally she is not a very happy person, and she feels that heathenry gives her a lot of personal strength and a kind of, not necessarily moral compass, but a kind of perhaps a code to live by to help her stay spiritually orientated. Oh, there's the image. Sorry about that. This is an image taken from Midgardsblot, which is kind of a heavy metal festival in Norway that's had some kind of pagan or heathen elements to it. This is another narrative. A person is a very successful man in Azerbaijan. He rubs shoulders with politicians and big business leaders. He, again, is solitary, and he is not interested in talking to heathens online, say in Russia, because he speaks Russian, as a lot of Azerbaijanis do. He wants actual real heathens in his life, basically. So who are these new heathens? I would kind of be tempted to call them tropical heathens, but you know, they're all over. But a lot of these countries where we are now finding them that haven't been researched and documented are hot countries. And that makes it also very interesting from not just from the branching out from the racial point of view, that the racial narrative and the issues that scholars have looked at before, but we've got this whole kind of how do you relate to a god of the frozen north when you live, say, like in Colombia, in the rainforest. So just to kind of make some generalizations here, in Israel, that we have more local groups. Obviously, as I said, in Japan and Azerbaijan, we don't have that. They're helping each other out with resources. They help each other bring mead. They have issues in Israel, obviously, getting hold of swine, pig meat, pork, because it's Israel, and pork is quite important historically to a lot of heathens, to the historical Germanic pagan religion. So some heathens, certainly the ones in Israel, find that this is something to pursue. Perhaps it's a kind of cultural rebellion. In Tunisia, we've got some interesting situations similar to Israel, in that there are religious extremists who will and do persecute neo-pagans. You can see that picture in the middle at the bottom. The chap to the left is heathen, and his sister is wearing a hijab. I don't think there's any more I need to say there. In Latin America, we have the context of Catholicism, machismo. There are almost like a homogeneous cultural set of cultural challenges from Mexico all the way through South America, which I think are very specific to that set of cultures compared to Japan, for instance. Although I'm not saying that sexism doesn't exist in Japan, it's just perhaps doesn't share the same amount of similarities as does it in the Hispanic languages. So in Israel, they are very creative. You know, they will make sacred bread, brew their own mead. They have issues worshipping outdoors because of the heat. As I said before, there's a prohibition against pork, but as you can see here, this could easily be, you know, a Hebrew Judaic family ritual. This is my contact in Tunisia. His grandmother is there to the left. She's Berber. She has Berber tattoos. He has had to do his own rituals he has a lack of access to good sources. So he's just kind of really tried to be very, very quiet about his rituals and make them very personal to him. So he writes prayers in runes on pieces of paper, burns them, offers an orange, you know, things in his garden. It's just it's very specific to him, basically, his religious life. He does have what you would consider perhaps generic heathen aesthetics, but he gets hold of what he can get hold of. He admits that he's influenced by media, video games, TV, films, that kind of thing. In Latin America, they've been around and quite organized in large groups. And as I say, Latin America is a massive generalization. They've been around for quite a while anyway. I would say closer to 20 years from what I've heard, but the first form, you know, organizations were about maybe coming up for 15 years ago soon. And they're literally in every single Latin American country, which is quite exciting. In Mexico, my informants have underlined the issues of machismo and something called Marianismo, which is where women are kind of idealized as either a mother figure or as a virgin figure, as in Virgin Mary, Marian. There's also an extremely aggressive sense of what has been called in Wicca, or studies of Wicca, gatekeeping. So hierarchy is very important. And obviously, because of the language barrier with English, not everybody has access to sources about the old religion or what the heathens are doing, say, in America. So it's very easy for a priest to kind of, I guess, start a cult of personality, if you like. In Mexico, which is extremely urbanized, you will find, as you can see, it's quite a busy place. And as with Israel, you'll have things, the practices, the way of being socially religious is a reflection on their own local culture. So here, basically, they're having a barbecue and a drink. And it overlaps with, say, in some cases, say, like gangster culture or biker culture. Costa Rica, they seem to be perhaps the most progressive of the sets of informants that I've found. I don't think I've been able to fit that data or represent that data in here, but they have recently just developed a feminist kind of outreach group. It's not actually just for females, it's also for other gender and harassed sexual minorities and identities. It's called Shield Maiden, the group, or a version of that, Skjaldmø. And they're just basically getting themselves organizing, being much more aggressive and active. In Colombia, they have much more of a overlap with things like Satanism, perhaps due to one or two particularly active guys who are supporting something that's called Asatru. Thurs is a historical word for a Norse kind of mountain demon or frost giant. They were the enemies of the gods. So it's a strange kind of black magic thing going on there. But not all Colombian heathens are into that, but they accept those kind of black magic practitioners as part of their community. In Brazil, there is a slight difference from the rest of Latin America because they're Portuguese speakers. So there's a bit of, they're slightly offset, a bit more unique from the others. They don't have direct communication with the rest of them, whereas all the other Latin American countries kind of do interact online and meet each other, across the borders and hang out. They, like the other Latin American countries, feel that they're basically being laughed at and not taken seriously. They also, when they live in the big cities, say in Brazil, or like Mexico City is a big place, they find it difficult to find places where they can commune with nature. And just to quickly jump into where I'm seeing how the trajectory here is, if we look at what's happened in the last couple of years with social politics, say like with Trump, with Brexit, with the rise of the far right and the alt-right in European politics, I think this is a really exciting phenomena, and it's a really interesting kind of global counter-cultural and socio-political movement that really deserves more support from scholars from an ethical point of view, without over-representing or disturbing the data, obviously. But I think, if we're trying to educate society and reflect what's happening in society, perhaps our consistent emphasis on scholars on racism and the race narrative is perhaps holding a lot of people back. It's certainly not helping people to break away from it and find new ways of dealing with the past and with religions that have been historically, in modern history, been tied to like blood and soil. So yeah, these are just, if you can quickly check those out, different social factors have happened in the last 10 or 20 years, and in these new countries where it's emerging. You've got to think of the religious backdrop. Before, it was mainly Protestantism in America, in the Anglo-Saxon countries, and in Europe. And obviously now we have these monolithic, very conservative, homogenous societies like Catholic backgrounds, Muslim backgrounds, and access to technology, to education, to media, to information and communicate. Social media with people speaking in the English language is affecting the characteristics of where these new communities are going. I don't think I'll have time for much more, but I'm very happy to hear any criticisms, any questions, and if you're interested in more sources where I can tie these things in.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ross. That was so fascinating. And you've got quite a few questions in the chat, but I'm going to ask people to, you're welcome to answer them in the chat, but we're going to have a time for audience questions, and I might let us go on a little bit after the time, but don't feel you have to stay, either speakers or audience, just because there's been such rich things to talk about here. I don't want to lose the opportunity. So we've got two speakers left. We've got Sarah Kerr, and then we've got a respondent who's going to try to bring up some of the themes. So next we've got Sarah Kerr, who's the current president of the Pagan Federation here in Britain, and she is going to be talking about the diversity of contemporary paganism.
Hello everyone, thank you very much, Suzanne, and thank you for asking me here today. I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. There we go. So as Suzanne said, I'm going to be speaking about diversity and paganism, most specifically within the Pagan Federation and the community that we serve. The Pagan Federation has a very long history now, spanning back over 50 years. It was originally started in 1968 as a newsletter to support a particular group of Wiccans, but it became very clear in a very short amount of time that there were more than Gardnerian Wiccans out there, and they were all looking for community and support in their practices. Just how diverse that community wasn't known at the time, and especially given the world as it was back in the late 60s, early 70s. Its aims particularly were to seek to support pagans in their personal and public lives, to promote a positive profile for pagans and paganism of all kinds, and to facilitate effective communication, to give education and create dialogue within pagan communities, and also with non-pagans and institutions. So even by the time we became an official organisation in 1971, we had begun embracing those who followed different beliefs and traditions to those held by Wiccans. And in the ratification speech given by Doreen Valiente, she said that unity is strength, and I welcome the fraternal unity of all sincere people who follow the pagan path. We may not always agree with each other, but we must support each other in our struggle for our right to follow the religion and lifestyle of our choice in the modern world. Now, as an organisation, and the aims that we have, this isn't an easy task, given the way that we've been seen and advertised over the last couple of thousand years, really. There's a huge amount of misunderstanding and misinformation out there, and of course, sensationalism when it comes to our practices and beliefs. Lots of people hear pagan and immediately jump to these kinds of thoughts. I think Melissa already mentioned the satanic panic of the 1980s. So, of course, a lot of people, when you say pagan, they immediately jump to the fact that we're all witches who dance naked in the woods and worship the devil. Well, of course, that really isn't true. Lots of pagans aren't witches. Very few dance naked in the woods, and especially here in Britain, where the weather is usually too cold and unpredictable for that to be comfortable. And devil worship is not a pagan thing. What we do share is that affinity for nature and that connection with the natural world. So that's from the environment that we live within as a part of, to all the things that we can be as a part of human nature. And that includes those things that have been seen as bad or evil parts of human nature in some parts of the world. To us, it all just is. It's just a part of who we are and what we are. We don't hesitate to accept and welcome into our lives all the things that we believe are a part of successful natural living. And that can mean different things depending on where in the world we are. So what our environment is like, the food that we have available, the culture we grow up in, and they're just a few examples. Our world and the beliefs and practices that shape it. I believe this image really shows it quite well. We're more about eco than we are about ego. Sorry, I've just lost where I'm at. Yeah, there we are. So this is why we've always accepted and welcomed people of all kinds into our community, because we accept that being a diverse bunch with all kinds of backgrounds, lifestyles and beliefs is quite natural. We also believe in cooperation and collaboration where possible, because we know that's how a community thrives. That's how the world has worked. And as society has evolved, especially over the last 20 years, so has our community. More and more people are looking into paganisms of varying kinds to support them in their daily lives and provide them with core beliefs on how the world should look and work. And as one of the oldest pagan organisations in existence in the UK, we have to move with society as it evolves and adapt while we keep our roots firm, planted in the knowledge and wisdom of the past. This is something that we're not new to. Paganisms have always evolved with the world around it because it is deeply tied to the world that we're a part of and how it changes and fluxes over time. Our practices indeed tell us that moving with the seasons and changing tides is a natural thing to do. As our society has learned, so have we. As an organisation, we're learning to become even more diverse, even more accepting and welcoming of our fellow humans. And as we do so, our community is growing as younger generations find a spiritual path that speaks to what they believe to be right. Of course, as we've heard, it also combines well with other faiths and traditions. No one can function in this world without knowing that the rights of marginalised people in society are coming to the forefront. They're being shouted about. They're being brought into the awareness of more and more people. And because as pagans, we have been marginalized ourselves, suffering discrimination and persecution ourselves as a result of our beliefs, we already have a solid base in welcoming others that have suffered for something they cannot change about themselves. We're also good at knowing when it's time to prune back the branches that are no longer needed. Outdated beliefs and practices can be left to history as new ones take seed and begin to thrive. It's the way of nature. The PF is a living, breathing entity in itself, and I have no shame in saying that in years now gone by, we haven't been perfect. We haven't always understood, and we haven't always done the right thing. The important thing is, though, that we're learning and we're listening to the generations that are coming to paganisms now. It started with the most diverse committee we've ever had 2 years ago. We now have more people with a wider variety of past than we've ever had before. We have already been working with pagan families, and we had established links with the education community. In 2016, we also established our disabilities team, shortly followed by the LGBTQIA team, in order to better support members of our community who had specific support needs and lifestyles. Our hospital and prison ministries teams support people at some of their most vulnerable and pivotal moments of their lives. And our interfaith teams seek to reach out and create connections with people of other faiths and religions so that we can seek to understand each other better and even work together for a more cohesive and connected society that supports, protects, and enables those who are marginalised to thrive in this evolving world. In the last 2 years, we established our cultural cohesion team. Some pagan practices come from indigenous cultures, and cultural appropriation has been an issue in our community simply because of the defining feature of paganisms, that we have no dogma, no hard and fast rules to follow, and no text to examine and contemplate. This means that some practices were picked up from cultures maybe not appreciated or understood as they should have been. This is an important conversation for us to have as a community, and establishing this team has meant that we're able to examine this issue more closely and tackle it head on so that we can educate not only our own community, but those outside of it, and ensure that proper appreciation is encouraged so that we stop stealing from others, causing pain and hardships for the sake of our practices. In short, we're trying to encourage as diverse and inclusive community as possible that leaves no one out in the cold. We know how that feels both historically and in our modern world today, and we don't want to perpetuate that for anyone. I'm glad to see that more and more people are finding paganisms and building them into their lives, especially younger generations who are discovering that no matter who they are and what their life is like, they can find something for them underneath the shelter of the pagan tree. It gives me hope that we are able to learn and grow from past mistakes enough that pagan beliefs and practices are appealing to more and more people. We've not only seen this growth in places like social media either. Our membership numbers show that this is happening in real terms. We've seen a growth of 35% in the last year alone, and that is huge. I have no doubt that is because we are visibly tackling these issues that are important not only to our community as it is, but also now to many people in the rest of the world who are finding what they need within our camp. And let's face it, these issues are of vital importance to our world and how it evolves in the future. I will leave it there. Thank you very much for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sarah, for that overview of contemporary paganism in Britain. And now we've got our final formal speaker before we have open question and answers, which is Professor Graham Harvey, who's at the Open University and has been a long-term commentator and reflector on things animist and pagan and all sorts of things. So over to Graham.
Thanks, Suzanne. Thanks for other informed colleagues. I apologise, I missed a bit of the presentation because apparently there's a festival coming up that involves people knocking on doors and trying to collect money. But they didn't sing anything this year, which is an interesting transformation. So, sorry, I should get off that theme. Great, thanks for the challenge of trying to respond to an exciting panel with quite diverse presentations. So I'm not going to summarize everything because you've heard it as well as I have. There's interesting conversations already going on in the chat. But I've been trying to take notes about what people say specifically about the word transformation in the title. And I've been trying to work out whether stuff I wrote a millennium ago about paganism, whether any of that is dramatically changed. And I think the answer is not too far. Some of the debates that were at least emergent back in the 90s, and by conversation with other people who were engaged with paganism before that. I mean, I'd say the 90s because that's when I was writing. I was hanging out with Druids since I skipped school in the 70s, which were the 60s in Wiltshire still. So I'm aware of what was happening before the 90s. But so there are some transformations going on, but they're clearly contested even between what Michael said about heathenry and what Ross and Rune said, in which there is clearly still a degree of racial self-identification and, to be clear, racism among some heathens. And that's not to say that they're the only pagans or the only religious people or the only people that any of us ever know who identify with racist movements and make their self-identification dependent on demonizing others. So Ross used the phrase, the narrative is changing about a number of things. And that's interesting to hear. I think it was already changing. There was already at least a tension between people like the Odinic Rite decades ago and other heathens or Asatru who were already claiming a more gender fluid, non-ethnically identified kind of pagan practice. So I'm pleased to hear that things are going on, and then we're in an interesting position too, thinking again about transformations. Excuse me 1 second. Transformation in the way in which scholars engage with pagans, or perhaps not a transformation. All of us engaged in the study of paganisms. Thank you, Sarah, for using the plural. Have for a long time struggled with whether we are insiders and therefore suspect, or whether we're outsiders and therefore suspect to another group of people, whether we can have a different position. This again is not a thing unique to the study of paganism, but clearly again we've had that tension represented in presentations in which presenters want to shape how paganism could become, and others who are perhaps describing how it is at the moment, whether or not they want to change it is perhaps left aside. There are interesting continuities identified. So Lucia used, there was a very nice image of Andy Letcher back in the day of the Newbury bypass protest, and of herself and others in Glasgow more recently. So there are some interesting, perhaps, transformations in the presence of multiply religious and multiply identified participative people in environmental activisms of different kind, whereas perhaps the Newbury bypass tended to separate. There was a pagan camp, and there were other camps of people differently doing different kinds of rituals and identifications. So perhaps that is a transformation, that there's more interaction between people of different traditions and none. Perhaps that too is represented in Sarah's representation of Pagan Federation as becoming more open to a diverse community within paganisms. So there's some exciting things there. I also think then there's a tension that I've noted before, but I'm intrigued to see how it's continuing to play out between a more, how do we say this, a more localized and a more universal practice of different paganisms. So the kind of, is paganism something that can be practiced in the same way wherever you are in the world, or do you localize, and Suzanne's terms, perhaps indigenize to where you are, or should pagan leaders encourage a more universal understanding of paganism, which might, in Michael's argument, combat some of the perhaps localized blood and land, blood and soil identifications. So there's an interesting tension. I'm not sure that's a new one, but perhaps it's being played out more dramatically, perhaps because the internet allows that to happen more. The comments in the chat have indicated other conversations going on in different religious communities. So although the presenters spoke about boundary issues or boundary crossings, transformation of celebration with people of other religions, mostly they were citing Christians and Buddhists, although and then Muslims as slightly more problematic connection. There are in the comments some of our Christian colleagues out there commenting on very clear links between what some Christians are doing, both at COP26, but also the perhaps not in the comment, but as I happen to know, the self-identification as Christian animism is there too. So there's some interesting things going on. So there's lots of interesting stuff, and I'm still not entirely sure that what we saw today was evidence of dramatic transformations. Perhaps some things are growing stronger, globalization, universalization, but at the same time, a tendency among perhaps other pagans to be more animistic in the sense of more localized, more specific land venerations and so on. Those things have been evident for a while, but perhaps they're stronger. I'm not saying there are necessarily a polarization, but interesting shifts. Definitely still an argument about nationalisms and others, but also perhaps the biggest transformation that I've seen in my career, the bit of my career studying paganism, was the one mentioned by several people or implied by several people, the influence of Ronald Hutton's and others' revision or recognition of a truer history of pagan identities. Interestingly, accepted, adopted, and often celebrated, but not always, by many pagans globally. So there becomes a very different origins narrative, and therefore an interesting different way of understanding how paganism works with other peoples, people and other traditions, religious or otherwise. I was taking lots of notes, and I now can't read them because my writing is so bad. And I'm sure I'm missing out all kinds of interesting other things that I thought I might say, but but perhaps I said enough. Oh, I love the Melissa. Thank you for saying the other tension between the wish to be countercultural and the coziness of pagans. I love the word cozy there, and I want to think more about that. And I suspect that we can all take that away and think that clearly there has been for a long time a desire to be countercultural, which kind of, my suspicion was that there was, despite some of the horrors of the satanic abuse accusations, that there was kind of, some people liked that kind of being dangerous and edgy and being a threat and being insulted. I mean, that's, again, not only of pagans. We're not the only people wanting to be a persecuted minority. The desire to be a victim is there in many religious traditions, or a martyr, perhaps that's the word that people would like to use. But the coziness is also there, and I think that's definitely one that needs more research. So really, thank you very much, presenters, and then I know there are going to be lots of interesting conversations and comments and questions because they're already there in the chat. So I'm going to shut up for a while. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you for that summary, Graham. You've got applause, silent applause happening from the speakers. So there's been so much interesting stuff going on in the chat, and I'm a bit, it's a bit tricky to go through and pull out things that haven't been answered. So if you've got a burning question that you want to say out loud, please use the raise hand feature in the bottom there under reactions, and I can call on you. I guess one question maybe to start off for all the speakers was in the chat box just about the influence of the internet, and to what extent do you think that's actually been transformative, or has it just amplified trends that were already in existence? So if any of the speakers want to kind of reflect on that, maybe a few of you in turn.
If I'm not interrupting anyone. Unless
go on, Ross,
tells me otherwise, I'll go.
Then Runa will go after you. Go on, Ross.
I published an article in the Pomegranate last year about heathen females on Instagram, and my conclusion from listening to their stories, at least, I tried not to project too much, and I found it difficult to find supporting studies that would help me come up with theories or shape my potential prejudices and things that I was inevitably taking into the sociology aspect of it. Listening to the stories, it seems like Instagram, at least in that case, which I think is perhaps you could say a microcosm of the types of things that are happening online, it really has given them a hell of a lot of freedom to express not just their religion, but giving them confidence as with their sexuality, with their gender, with their identity, not just as religious peoples, but giving them that kind of holistic whole to be a personality. And I didn't get the sense that it was an ego thing either. On a social level, and amongst heathens and certainly pagans that I know, that there's quite a lot of shit talking about women on Instagram, and people were putting it down, and I did kind of think some of that, but when I was actually listening to the stories, it was pretty obvious that they were putting a lot of time and energy into what they do on their Instagram. It wasn't just vanity. And I'm sure, I know for a fact there are a lot of dark sides to the internet, but I definitely think that the internet is creating new realities for people. Because the internet has, whether it's an app or whether it's soon it's going to be VR and augmented reality, and Facebook is doing this thing with Meta, and oh god, it's going to be crazy. So I think that it's going to change who we are as human beings. So I do think it's not about amplifying what was there before. I think we are seeing total changes, absolute fundamental changes because of the internet.
Fantastic. Rune, and then Michael, and then if other people want to ask a question, or I know there's lots of other experts in the audience that haven't been speaking, so do think about if you want to say something. Rune?
Yeah, I just want to make one comment that maybe can serve as an add-on to all the reflections on racism and perhaps other bigoted ideologies, nationalisms, and so on, is the following. I have this from the scholar Joseph Hopkins. The Dutch scholar of esotericism, Wouter Hanegraaff, talks about how esoteric worldviews have a very long history of being rejected from normative forms of knowing in the Western world. I think that, yes, there is a huge problem with racism and paganisms interacting and nationalisms, but the ascription of ultranationalism to paganism is in itself a rejection process. And I think that needs to be included in our understanding of this stuff. A good example, recent example, was the attack on the Capitol in the USA. This was basically an evangelist revival movement, if I'm not mistaken. I haven't studied the whole QAnon and all that stuff, but that's my impression. What was the image that was spread all over the world? It was seen, from Tasmania to Kamchatka. It was an image of some kind of clownish dude that was wearing some heathen-looking tattoos and some pseudo-indigenous gear. Now, the media latches onto this exotifying image because it appeals to already existing patterns of othering of non-normative knowledge forms. Another extreme example is Nazi Germany, which was tightly connected with Christianity at many levels, from churches to the messianic aspirations of Hitler and the concrete institutional involvement of churches and so on. But what does people latch onto after the fact? They latch onto the fact that there were a couple of the leading guys who were sort of larping around with some nordicist looking stuff. Okay, they also had it a little bit on their uniforms and stuff, but the involvement of the churches in that problem is so completely whitewashed by the emphasis on pagan association that even today, one of the leading, the leading conservative party in Germany is called the Christliche Deutsche Union. It is a Christian-identified party. This is a part of rejection patterns, and I really think it would be important that we sort of include that perspective a little bit when we certainly do continue to criticize the interface between racisms and paganisms.
That's a really great point, Rune. Michael, then Lucia, and then Susan Palmer. Michael.
I just wanted to respond to the internet theme to say that I think in a way it's just functioning as it has for a long time. It's providing new opportunities for community. But I worry that it may also, as we see in other areas of society, provide more foundation for really noxious movements of racist and sexist individuals just spewing a lot of poison. And I worry of how this does affect paganism. Not that I see any direct connection, but I worry that the right wing can be energized by this, because they seem to do very well feeding off negative emotions like hatred and anger and ideologies like nationalism, etc. So I don't know if it's so different really, but it certainly is. The internet and digital social media are affecting everything. So of course they'll affect paganism like everything else. And to just respond to what Rune was saying about this long-term trend toward rejection, being that I'm living in the land of Trump, I have to say I'm not so confident about these tendencies being rejected by some, but embraced by others. So, you know, the battle between the forces of light and darkness, chaos and order goes on, unfortunately.
Thanks for those, Lucia.
Okay, thank you. So just a comment, because previously I've spoken about witch talk, so that's witches on TikTok, and I think it's quite interesting. So it's like, for me, growing up when I was a young teenager, I was kind of trying to hide the fact I had a pagan family for fear of being a weirdo, and I feel like I had to try to be extra nice or whatever so that like people would accept me, which is a common thing of like marginalized people from marginalized religious communities. But now there's there's so many TikTok jokes about that girl who's into crystals or whatever, that actually that's opened the door to actually understanding witchcraft, Wicca, paganism, and it's becoming more accepted. The problem with that is also there's a lot of people calling themselves witches who may not quite understand Wicca and might be adopting that term without properly understanding what it means. But I don't think that's our role to gatekeep. I think it's a way for us to be as inclusive as possible and let as many people join through whatever internet channel they find it, just like as people find Wicca maybe through picking up tarot cards, picking up a random book in a bookstore. It's the same kind of process, but on the internet now. And I think the internet, it has a way of regenerating so quickly that we see these movements grow and grow and grow, and quicker than we can even understand what's going on. But also coming to what you said about difficulties with the internet and like racism and that kind of thing, what I've seen, at least on TikTok and Instagram, is actually that a lot of the generally like pagan women I follow are also very like advocate feminism, anti-racism, and a lot of LGBT rights as well. And I do see that a lot on social media, and I feel like it can be used for a force of good as well as bad too.
Thank you. Susan Palmer?
Just a minute. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm not an expert on paganism and Wicca, although I do teach a course at Concordia on witchcraft, and I've tried to include quite a bit about, you know, neo-paganism, which I find fascinating. But I would have expected, you know, this being forced to go on the internet or forced to go on Zoom instead of having live meetings. I would have expected a rather dampening effect. There's sensual deprivation. For example, I was going to take my students to a full moon gathering, and then I was told it had been moved to Zoom. I was planning to go in the summer to a Druid, you know, gathering in the woods, and I was thinking about bonfires and smelling, you know, forest and playing the harp and dancing. And no, it's all on Zoom. And I just find this rather depressing, and it doesn't have this, it seems the point is connection to nature. And how can you connect to trees and plants and flowers and the moon if you're just on Zoom all the time? So I wondered what these experts thought about that.
So I don't know. I think Sarah's raised her hand in direct response to that. So I'll let Sarah respond, and then I'll go to Viola.
I think for a lot of our community, there are certain parts of our community, certain people within our community who can't go out in nature anymore. You know, they're disabled, or it's not safe for them in some respects. And I think for them, that connection over Zoom is just as vital as somebody's connection to the natural world. So I think it's an understandable need and connection. But I do understand where you're coming from. One thing that I've particularly missed over the last 2 years is connection to people and to those things that connect me to nature. So being able to go out into the woods with my friends and conduct a ritual, or you know, I've been able to do it privately by myself, but being able to do it in the groups that I normally associate with has been incredibly difficult. So I think, again, to echo what Lucia said, it's a good and a bad thing in some respects, because it broadens the scope of connection for people who can't get out, who can't access those things. And, you know, for them, it's vitally important. And we've certainly seen that over the last 2 years. I think while people haven't been able to access these things, is that at the very least they can connect with like-minded people, and that they can connect with people who have a similar sort of way of viewing the world. But it also has that effect of disconnecting us at the same time. And I think that's something that we have to be really cautious with.
Great, thanks. Viola?
Thank you. Can you hear me properly? So first of all, thank you for all these very exciting and inspiring presentations. I would like to go back to this question of racism and localized and universalized forms of paganisms. Actually, as someone who is currently studying pagan renewal in Hungary, I can perhaps give some elements to think about these issues, because here this connection between paganism and political right is very, very marked, as you probably know, and I think it's the hardest questions to be solved. So all I wanted to make is some ethnographic comments about my intellectual struggle understanding that, because in my fieldwork experience, there is a tension even inside the pagan universe of practices, so to say, because practitioners and leaders constantly deny their political stance. They say we're not doing politics, and at the same time, the government supports some forms of pagan activities, mostly festivals. But what I see, just to make a very, very long story short, is that in practice, it is as if nationalism was structurally equivalent to spirituality. Is that by being a good Hungarian, a good pagan Hungarian, and reaching back to those roots, it was the best way of spiritual a connection and this connection to nature. But I think this tension actually is something that is somehow intrinsic to the dynamics of this whole universe of practices. I'm not sure if I made myself clear, but what I wanted to suggest, what I would love to do is really to go on discussing these things, and hopefully I will publish something on the matter, but I don't know yet, because it's a hard issue. So thank you.
I just want to kind of acknowledge that we're reaching the time we advertised we'd end. And so just want, before people leave, thank you to everyone who contributed and all the speakers who all made excellent contributions. Also, thank you to Sarah and Warwick, who sent invitations, Silky, who has been handling the IT, and Ruby, who's been live tweeting and doing all our social media. So quick thank yous before the end of this, people drop out. There is an interesting question which Austin was asking, and I could try to paraphrase it, but do you want to try to ask it verbally, or do you want me to try to paraphrase it?
I can just, I mean, I was just, I can just read it. My brain's not really functioning, which is why I typed it out. But I guess I was just, I don't want to downplay the, the impact colonization has had, I guess, on indigenous peoples in any way whatsoever. But I'm doing a doctorate in anthropology on Druidry, and I've been talking to a lot of Druids. And it's interesting to kind of hear this theme come up of, we're all victims of colonization. All the crisis we face in the Anthropocene, the kind of feelings of disconnection and kind of mental health stuff, fostered by consumer culture and all these kinds of things. So when understood as a worldview, I know many modern Druids and others living in modernity might be seen as colonized peoples in some ways. So it seems that following a nature-centered animistic path like Druidry, while it may not be indigenous, it is like, in a sense, a way of fighting back against the colonial worldview and its consequences, which again we're all kind of victims of. So it is a worldview and an acting out of that worldview that has really created these problems. So with that said, I was wondering, do we limit ourselves in any way by focusing so strongly on the relationship between colonization and race and ethnicity? And when in these conversations would it be helpful, if at all, to focus on colonization as a worldview? So I was just curious to get more people's thoughts on this. So thank you.
Rune has raised his hand to respond. Go on.
Well, I think that when it comes to addressing nationalisms in these contexts, I don't think there is a space for not addressing it. It's a sort of a mirror to perhaps being racialized as Black or something like that yourself. You can't just say, okay, I'm not going to deal with racism today. Today I'm going to be working on climate change. Racism is going to be there. And I think it's the same for us here. I also think on the indigenous issue, I just want to spit in what my own position, and I haven't thought nearly as much about this as some of you others, but I've resolved to just use the word traditional, partly because when you talk about knowledge, it means kind of the same, but it doesn't imply political marginalization in the same way as indigenous. We can, as majority populations, as your descendants, we can talk about indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, we can talk about perhaps traditional religion. And then by using the word traditional, we are also addressing, also in that respect, we are targeting stuff like ultranationalisms by reforging the way that the Nouvelle Droite, the whole Benoit and radical traditionalisms have been putting themselves on that word, which really means more or less the opposite of what these people say it means. It doesn't mean static and conservative. It means transformational and organic and so on. So anyway, so that's just what I have been kind of my working position on the indigenous issue.
Great, thanks. Suzanne, Owen?
Yes, obviously, I think it's something I've actually been contemplating quite a long time about the relationship between pagans and indigenous people, and particularly with Druidry. And in my personal relations with indigenous people I've met, they've welcomed that Europeans are also looking, into their own traditions and nature and things like this. But I think there's also a kind of fear that pagans might take over their space. And this was particularly in international forums for indigenous indigenous peoples. And I think they would probably be a little bit wary if pagans suddenly turned up and took their space a little bit. So I think there has to be that. I think Sarah Kerr from Pagan Federation mentioned this earlier, a little bit of a balance towards avoiding appropriation but appreciating. But at the same time, there is also a welcome, that we have common interests in, perhaps, to do with nature and anti-colonialism and so forth. So definitely there's dialogue that is very welcome, but respectfully and allowing, the recognition of indigenous peoples as colonized peoples as different from pagans.
Thanks, Suzanne. Michael and then Lucia.
Yeah, I've wrestled with this terminology issue for a long time. And I really think so much of it just goes down to always striving to show respect for people. And I think many indigenous people have made clear that they would not want to be considered pagan. I haven't seen that label embraced by people following indigenous religions. Whereas in the frankly white world, the white dominated Euro-American, Australian world, so to speak, the word pagan has for a long time been used by many people who are following pre-Christian or pre-Christian based nature-oriented religions. So I think in the different contexts, each term has its place. But I would acknowledge there is plenty of overlap between pagan religious traditions and indigenous religious traditions. But I think in a in our social and political world, we have to be careful to show sensitivity. And it also depends on how much time you have in a particular interaction to explain your position. So if you only have, 1 minute to talk to someone from a community you've never met before, it's a good idea to not use language that's going to put them off or be offensive. If you can talk to them for an hour, maybe then you can speak more about how these things overlap and so forth. So I think, Austin, with the work you're doing, I think it's fine to raise these questions and just be sure to explain yourself very fully and show sensitivity and respect to others as much as possible.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Lucia, and then Kavita.
So I'm not an expert in this field, but I have done a lot of, like during COP26, we did do some work with indigenous people who came to campaign, and it was interesting talking to them. But just thinking, like drawing upon the work of Paulo Freire with his pedagogy of the oppressed, I think it's possible to be both a part of a community that might identify as both oppressor and oppressed. I think it's just the role to make sure that we separate and recognize differences of oppression different groups face depending on the individual circumstance. And that comes from practices of empathy and having this idea of liberating education, empathy over education, and being very careful when using labels and walking in to someone else's space and actively decolonize and actively taking an anti-racist approach to our own thinking when it comes to labeling particular groups.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Very helpful. And Kavita?
Hi. Yeah, I found this last exchange really interesting. So I've actually written on this topic. I wrote my PhD on the question of, the goddess movement and claims to the goddess movement people claiming to be the colonized. And this was what the whole thesis hinged on. And I've also published on that. I've got more to do on this topic. But I think it's really important to keep in mind that these political differentiations are important. And also, I know that there's a lot of emphasis sort of in pagan and lived religion studies about, taking seriously research participants' identifications and the way they describe themselves. But I also think it's important to keep in mind a critical perspective, and also who is defining colonized, who is defining what racism is and why. And I would suggest that actually there needs to be more discussion of how people are defining racism within the field of pagan studies and scholarship on paganism, and to perhaps engage a bit more with sort of critical race perspectives, what people of colour are writing about this topic. There's not much interaction there so far in the field of pagan studies, and I think there should be.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'm conscious that is probably dinner time for a lot of us, and other times of the day for other people in other parts of the world. It's fantastic that we can bring the world together now online sometimes. But it would be great to go to the pub and have a longer chat. So I feel very, very torn. If anyone has any last reflections, I don't know if any of the speakers want to say anything at the very end. No, people are okay. So I'll wrap it up for tonight. But I think this was fantastic discussion, fantastic speakers, really interesting things to think about, and just thank you all so much for coming and participating.